The beach was crowded, laughter echoing under the summer sun. But beyond the breakers, the predator hunted, unseen and unchallenged. I dove under a wave and the world turned silent except for my heartbeat. A shadow rushed toward me, and the silence shattered. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The sun peeked over the jagged horizon, casting a warm orange glow on the sleepy town of Gansby, South Africa. The morning mist still clung to the water, giving the ocean a surreal, ethereal beauty. Jacob Hensley tightened the straps on his kayak and took a deep breath, savoring the salty tang of the sea air. For a 46-year-old man who had spent much of his adult life kayaking and fishing, Shark Alley was both a challenge and a sanctuary. This morning, it was the latter. "You're really going out alone today, huh?" came a voice from behind. Jacob turned to see Peter, a local fisherman, wiping his hands on a tattered rag. "Yeah, Pete," Jacob said with a grin. "Just me, the ocean, and some peace and quiet." Peter frowned, his weathered face pulling into a tight knot. "You know this area's no joke. Not just the shark's currents can drag you out faster than you realize." Jacob chuckled. "I've been doing this for years. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." He patted his life jacket for emphasis. Peter shook his head. "Just be careful, all right? Sharks are acting strange this season. More aggressive, more sightings close to shore. Don't push your luck." "Will do," Jacob replied, giving a half salute as he shoved the kayak into the surf. The waves lapped against the hull as he climbed in, his paddle slicing cleanly through the water. For the first half hour, the rhythmic motion of paddling lulled him into a meditative calm. The gentle slosh of water against the kayak and the distant cries of gulls created a soothing soundtrack. Shark Alley stretched before him, a labyrinth of dark waters teeming with marine life. Seals darted in and out of view near a rocky outcrop, their sleek forms shimmering under the morning sun. "This," Jacob murmured to himself, "is living." As he ventured farther, the water grew darker, a stark contrast to the bright sky above. The ocean here was alive, the surface occasionally rippling as fish darted away from unseen predators below. Jacob noticed it but wasn't concerned. It was a natural part of the marine food chain. About an hour into his trip, the usual harmony of the sea began to shift. The birds grew quieter, their distant cries fading into an uneasy silence. Even the seals seemed to have disappeared. Jacob paused, resting his paddle across the kayak. "That's odd," he muttered, scanning the horizon. The water around him seemed unnaturally still. A faint ripple to his left caught his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing, just the vast open sea. "All right, Hensley," he said aloud, forcing a laugh. "You're letting Pete get in your head." He dipped the paddle back into the water, pushing forward. But the unease lingered. The feeling that he wasn't alone gnawed at the edges of his mind. A sharp thunk jolted him out of his thoughts. The kayak rocked violently to one side. Jacob gripped the edges, his heart pounding. What the hell was that? Another thunk, this time from beneath. The kayak pitched, nearly throwing him overboard. Panic surged as he scrambled to steady himself. Okay, stay calm," he said, his voice shaky. Then he saw it, a dorsal fin slicing through the water about 30 feet away. It was massive, far larger than he'd ever seen in the wild. "Oh no." Blow. The fin disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only a ripple. Jacob's breath came in shallow gasps as he instinctively reached for the emergency knife strapped to his vest. "Stay away," he whispered, his eyes darting across the water. The kayak rocked again, harder this time. Jacob felt the unmistakable scrape of something large against the hull. He tightened his grip on the paddle, his knuckles white. "Come on, man. Don't do this. Just go." The fin reappeared, closer now, circling. The shark's movements were methodical, almost deliberate, as if sizing him up. Jacob's mind raced, every survival tip he'd ever read or heard flashing through his brain. "Make yourself big," he muttered. "Stay calm. Don't thrash." The shark vanished again. Jacob strained to see into the murky depths, but the ocean offered no answers. The silence was deafening. A sudden, violent impact from below launched the kayak into the air. Jacob screamed as he was thrown into the water, the cold shock of it knocking the wind out of him. He surfaced, gasping, the taste of salt and fear in his mouth. The kayak floated a few feet away, overturned. Jacob swam toward it, his injured leg dragging behind him. Another shadow passed beneath him, larger than he'd imagined possible. The shark's massive body glided just below the surface, its black eyes devoid of emotion. "Help!" Jacob screamed, his voice cracking. He clawed at the kayak, pulling himself halfway onto its slick surface. The shark struck again, ramming the kayak with such force that Jacob nearly lost his grip. He cried out, his heart hammering as he swung the paddle in a desperate attempt to deter the predator. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice raw with terror. The shark circled again, its dorsal fin cutting through the water like a knife. Jacob's mind raced. He knew he couldn't stay on the kayak forever. His leg throbbed, and he could feel the warm trickle of blood mixing with the seawater. "I can't die like this," he whispered. There off, he spotted a fishing boat, its silhouette hazy against the horizon. He waved frantically, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Help! Over here! Please!" On the boat, a fisherman raised his binoculars, his face paling as he registered the scene. "Shark attack! We need to call the rescue team," he yelled to his crew. Jacob, clinging to the kayak for dear life, felt a flicker of hope. But the shark wasn't done. Turned sharply, aiming directly for him. As it closed the distance, Jacob let out a primal scream, raising his paddle in one last act of defiance. The ocean surged around him, the predator's unstoppable force meeting his fragile humanity. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the edges of the kayak, the water around him eerily still. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he scanned the horizon. The fin he had seen earlier still haunted his mind, its memory too vivid to ignore. It had been enormous, so much bigger than any shark he had ever encountered. He had heard the tales, of course, about the great white sharks in this part of the world, but hearing about them was different from feeling their presence. The ocean was unervingly quiet, the usual symphony of waves crashing against rocks, the distant cry of gulls, the soft splash of fish swimming beneath the surface, all of it had vanished. It was as if the sea itself was holding its breath. Jacob fought the rising panic, willing himself to stay calm. "All right, just get it together, Jacob," he muttered under his breath, trying to steady his hands on the paddle. "It's probably just a seal or a dolphin. No need to freak out." The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. He began to paddle again, pushing the kayak further into the deeper waters of Shark Alley. He didn't want to turn back. Not yet. There was still so much he wanted to explore, so much he hadn't seen. But as he paddled forward, the weight in the pit of his stomach grew heavier, the unsettling feeling that he wasn't alone becoming harder to ignore. The water beneath the kayak seemed to darken, a shift in the current pulling at the edges of his boat. Jacob paused again, feeling the change. It wasn't drastic, but the sense of something waiting just beneath the surface was unmistakable. A flicker of movement in the water caught his eye. At first, it was just a blur, a flash of gray darting through the depths. But then it reappeared, closer this time, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The dorsal fin sliced through the water again. Closer. This time, Jacob could see its size more clearly. It wasn't a seal or a dolphin. It wasn't even a smaller shark. No, this was something much larger. The fin was broad, unmistakable. This was a great white. "Okay, Jacob, stay calm," he whispered to himself, gripping the paddle tighter. The last thing he needed was to panic. He'd read all the books, listened to the advice, but none of that mattered when you were staring at a predator that could take your life in a heartbeat. The fin disappeared beneath the surface again, leaving a wake that slowly faded away. Jacob didn't move. He didn't even blink. His eyes were fixed on the spot where it had vanished, waiting for any sign that it was coming back. The minutes dragged on in agonizing silence. Don't make any sudden moves, sir, he thought. But even as he tried to steady his nerves, his mind raced. How close was it? Was it circling, or had it just lost interest? There was no way to know. But then, as if in answer to his thoughts, the shark broke the surface once again. This time only a few feet away from his kayak. Jacob's stomach lurched. The shark was enormous, its sleek, muscular body cutting effortlessly through the water. The water rippled around it, creating an eerie calm as it glided closer. It was like something out of a nightmare, a massive predator, moving with the grace of a dancer yet carrying the brute force of a killer. Its black eyes locked onto Jacob's, and for a moment, he could swear it was studying him. Jacob's breath hitched. He instinctively pulled his legs up against the hull of the kayak, his pulse thundering in his ears. It was hard to tell if the shark was curious or if it was simply sizing him up as prey. Either way, he had to act. Stay calm. Don't panic, Jacob repeated under his breath. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced them to steady as he gripped the paddle. If he could just keep his distance, if he could just stay in control, maybe he could make it out of this. But the shark didn't seem to be leaving. Instead, it swam in a slow, deliberate circle around him. Jacob's mind raced. He knew better than to try to outrun a shark, it would only provoke it. He also knew that hitting it with the paddle was likely pointless. The shark's skin was tough, and its body was built for powerful bursts of speed, not to mention the deadly force it could generate in a single strike. He had no weapons, no way to protect himself, other than the knife strapped to his vest. His only advantage was his kayak. He glanced around again, hoping for the distant shape of a rescue boat or another sign of life. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of water surrounding him. The shark circled again, its massive body undulating beneath the surface, and Jacob's anxiety only grew. He glanced down at his leg, still feeling the faint ache from an old injury. The last thing he needed was for the shark to see him as an easy target. The predator's fin surfaced again, this time closer than before, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. It was moving in for another pass, its body cutting the water with eerie precision. He had only seconds to react. Focus, he told himself, but his instincts began to overtake reason. The shark lunged suddenly, its body striking the side of the kayak with a deafening thud. The force of the impact rocked Jacob, throwing him off balance. Before he could grab the edge of the boat, the kayak was knocked sideways, tipping violently into the water. The world spun as Jacob was thrown into the icy grip of the ocean. His body hit the water with a sharp, cold shock, and for a moment he couldn't remember which way was up. Panic gripped him as he fought to get to the surface. He gasped for air, but the shark was already circling. Jacob's eyes shot to the kayak, which now floated just out of reach, but the predator was between him and it. He had no choice. His body screamed in protest, but he had to move. He had to swim for his life. As he kicked furiously, trying to swim away, a shadow passed underneath him. He froze. The water around him seemed to vibrate with the shark's presence, and for a split second, he felt its massive body glide beneath his legs. He shuddered, fighting every urge to panic. The shark was still there, watching him. It was only then that Jacob realized how close he was to being a statistic. How many people had underestimated the power of a shark, only to end up on the wrong end of the food chain. "Stay calm, Jacob," he whispered again, though the words were starting to feel like a lie. He was scared, terrified, but he couldn't afford to let the fear take over. The shark's fin appeared again, this time much closer. Its movements were precise, controlled like it knew exactly what it was doing. And for the first time, Jacob realized something terrifying. The shark wasn't just curious. He was hunting. He gripped his paddle tightly, willing himself to hold on. There was no way out of this except to fight, or worse yet, to hope. The ocean around him seemed to hold its breath. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest, the rhythmic thud of panic pounding in his ears as he tumbled through the water. Every inch of him screamed for air, his lungs burning from the cold and exertion. His legs, weighed down by the pull of the ocean and his injury, felt sluggish and weak. The world was a blur of swirling water and dark shadows beneath the surface. He surfaced with a gasp, his face stinging from the salt water, eyes wide in terror. The kayak was nowhere in sight. His pulse quickened as he looked around, but all he could see was the vast expanse of ocean stretching in every direction. Then, the unmistakable shadow loomed beneath him, a dark form cutting through the water with terrifying grace. The shark was back. It wasn't just any shark, Jacob knew that much. Its dorsal fin sliced the surface like a blade, just a few feet away. His pulse skipped, and fear surged through him like a surge of electricity. The predator was circling him again, its massive, sleek body gliding beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment. _focus. Jacob, focus. Don't panic. _ He tried to hold on to some semblance of control, but the crushing weight of the situation made it hard to breathe. His leg, a slow burning throb from where the shark had first struck, was a constant reminder of his vulnerability. It felt like dead weight in the water, a target just waiting to be picked off. Jacob flailed toward the faint outline of the overturned kayak, but the shark's ominous presence pressed in on him. He could hear nothing but his own ragged breathing, and the sound of his heart hammering in his chest. The shark didn't strike immediately. Instead, it seemed to be sizing him up. Jacob's eyes locked onto the predator's dorsal fin as it appeared again, slicing the water with terrifying precision. For a split second, the shark paused, its dark eyes locked on Jacob, its movements calculated, deliberate. Then, without warning, it lunged. Jacob screamed as the shark surged toward him, the cold, monstrous force of it bearing down on him with terrifying speed. The moment stretched in slow motion. Time seemed to slow as Jacob's body froze, instinctively realizing the inevitability of what was about to happen. He knew that if he didn't act now, it would be over in an instant. A sudden burst of adrenaline jolted through his body as he kicked with every ounce of strength, pushing himself upward. His hand found the emergency knife strapped to his life jacket, and in one desperate motion, he drew it out. The shark's massive jaws opened wide, its teeth glistening in the sunlight like rows of knives. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he saw the size of the maw coming toward him. The water around him churned, but with a cry of terror and desperation, he drove the knife downward, aiming for the shark's exposed snout. The shark jerked back with incredible force, its head snapping away from him. But Jacob's heart was still in his throat. He hadn't done enough. His leg was exposed, too vulnerable. He could feel the cold steel of the knife vibrating from the force of the impact, but he knew the shark was still circling. The pain from his leg flared raw, searing, a reminder of the first bite, the shark's teeth sinking into flesh and muscle. His vision blurred from the agony. He couldn't lose focus now. He couldn't afford to think about the pain. The shark retreated, its dark body rippling through the water as it glided just out of reach. But Jacob knew better than to let his guard down. He had to keep moving. He had to get away. He kicked with all the strength he could muster, moving toward the kayak. But his body was already exhausted, his muscles screaming for relief. His leg, heavy with pain, dragged behind him, each stroke feeling like it took more energy than he had. The cold water burned his skin, and his head swam with dizziness. Then, just as hope flickered in his chest, the shark struck again. The predator's enormous body slammed into him from below, the force of the impact sending him tumbling backward into the water. Jacob's world tilted, and for a moment he was completely submerged. He had no idea which way was up or down, only the crushing sensation of being pulled under. Water flooded his mouth as he struggled to break free. He pushed, fought against the pull of the ocean, but the shark was relentless. Its body slammed into him once more, this time with even more force. The kayak was gone now, tossed aside by the violent collision. Jacob's body slammed into the shark's thick hide, his limbs flailing helplessly. Panic surged again. This is it. This is how it ends. But even as his mind screamed with fear, something inside Jacob fought back. He couldn't let it end like this. Not now. Not after everything. His survival instincts kicked in, and with a scream, he drove the knife into the water, aiming blindly at the predator. This time, the blade found its mark. He felt the knife sink into something soft flesh. The shark recoiled, its body jerking away as it let out a sound that was almost like a growl. It surged forward again, but this time it hesitated. The knife had caused enough damage to force it back, and the predator drifted away, its dark eyes locking on Jacob one last time before it disappeared beneath the surface. Jacob's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. He couldn't believe it. He was alive, for now. He gasped for air, his head breaking the surface as he struggled to keep himself afloat. The water was thick with his blood, though he couldn't tell how much had been lost. His leg felt numb, and the pain had faded into a dull, constant throb. But the terror remained. Shivering from exhaustion, Jacob tried to gather his thoughts. His chest was tight, his body shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline, and his mind was foggy from the overwhelming rush of fear. He had to do something. He couldn't just float here and wait for the shark to come back. He had to get to safety. That's when he saw it, the faint silhouette of a boat on the horizon. He was a distant speck, but it was there. A rescue boat. He wasn't sure how far away it was, but it was his only hope. "Help! Over here! Please!" His voice cracked as he shouted, the words almost lost to the wind. He wasn't sure if the boat had seen him. His limbs were starting to feel like lead, and his vision was blurring from exhaustion. But then, the boat shifted slightly, and Jacob's heart skipped. The boat was coming closer. They had seen him. With whatever strength he had left, Jacob raised his arms, waving weakly. His leg was a mess of torn flesh and exposed bone, and his energy was spent, but he refused to give up. He wasn't done yet. Through the haze of pain and panic, he heard a voice, a lifeguard's voice, booming through the water, giving orders. The boat turned, its engines roaring louder as it cut through the waves. Jacob felt himself slipping. His vision darkened, and he could no longer keep his eyes open. His body gave way and he collapsed into unconsciousness, just as the rescue boat reached him. As the boat drew closer, Jacob's world grew quieter. The waves were still, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. Jacob barely registered the soft hum of the rescue boat's engine as he slipped in and out of consciousness. His body felt like dead weight, numb and aching. Every inch of him throbbed, from the gaping wound in his leg to the places where the shark's powerful body had struck him. The faint taste of salt water still lingered in his mouth, and he could almost feel the oppressive weight of the ocean pushing down on him again. It was the sound of shouting that roused him, the urgency in the voices pulling him from the fog of shock. He groaned as he shifted his head, squinting against the harsh daylight. The rescue boat had arrived, and the crew was already pulling him in. "Hold on, mate!" a voice yelled over the roar of the engine. It was a man young, probably in his early 30s, his face set in a grim expression as he helped guide Jacob toward the boat. Jacob tried to speak, but his throat was dry, cracked. "SH Shark?" he rasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We know," the man said, his grip firm around Jacob's shoulders. "You're safe now." Jacob was dimly aware of others on the boat, their hands pulling him aboard, but he couldn't focus. His vision was hazy, and everything felt distant, muffled. He heard the crackle of a radio and the voice of someone urgently relaying information to the Coast Guard. But just as quickly as he was pulled from the cold water, the sense of safety started to dissolve. A faint ripple in the water caught his attention, a shadow moving just beneath the surface. At first, he thought it was the reflection of the boat, but then it grew larger, darker. His heart skipped a beat. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The crew member who had been helping him paused. "What's wrong?" Jacob's eyes were wide with terror as he reached out a trembling hand. It's still there. The shark." The man's face tightened, and his head whipped around, eyes scanning the water. The other members of the crew had already noticed the disturbance. "It's circling again," one of them muttered, a woman with dark, wind-blown hair. "Jet him to the back of the boat. Quick!" "Moles!" the first man barked, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get him out of the water. Now!" Jacob's mind was spinning. He tried to lift himself, to move to the back of the boat as they told him, but his body wouldn't respond. He felt weak, helpless. The pain in his leg flared again, and he gritted his teeth against it. His pulse pounded in his ears. And then it happened. The boat lurched. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the water. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the shadow beneath the surface grew. Much larger than before, its movements swift and deliberate. "Jesus, it's back!" the woman shouted. Before anyone could react, the boat lurched again, this time more violently. The water churned beneath him, sending waves crashing against the sides of the vessel. Jacob's mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. The shark was striking again, this time not at him directly, but at the boat. It was using its full power, ramming the hull with terrifying force. The sound was deafening, metal groaning against the pressure. A sickening thud followed by splintering wood. Jacob's stomach lurched with the impact, and for a moment, he thought the boat might capsize. He clung to the nearest rail, his fingers slipping on the slick surface, every muscle in his body locked with fear. "Hold on," the man yelled, as he braced himself against the side. "Get the lines, secure everything." The crew scrambled, their movements frantic. Jacob's eyes darted between them, his body still fighting to stay conscious. The shark had reappeared, its massive body circling the boat like a predator toying with its prey. It breached the surface once more, this time even closer. Its massive body was a blur of silver and white, its eyes dark and calculating. It was large, much larger than Jacob had ever imagined, and the power of its movements shook the water with each passing moment. "We need to get out of here," the woman shouted. "Now! Keep it steady!" The man at the helm barked, his knuckles white on the wheel. "If we start moving too fast, we'll lose control." Jacob's chest tightened, and his breath became ragged as the boat bucked beneath him. The shark was relentless, battering the boat, forcing it into a dangerous roll with every strike. He could feel the vibrations of the animal's force reverberating through the hull. The panic in the air was palpable. The crew members were shouting over each other, trying to maintain control of the boat, but it was obvious that they were fighting a losing battle. Jacob could feel the weight of the ocean pressing in on them, and all he could think was that the boat wasn't going to hold. Suddenly, with an ear-splitting crash, the shark made another strike. The boat was rocked violently, throwing Jacob sideways. He yelped in pain, his legs screaming as it collided with the hard surface of the deck. He can barely keep his grip, his body swaying with the violent motion of the water. It was chaos. "Get him down below," someone shouted. Before Jacob could react, he was grabbed, his injured leg throbbing as they dragged him toward the lower deck. The noise from above was deafening, but the further they moved down, the quieter it became. He could hear the soft lapping of the water against the sides of the boat, the frantic voices of the crew above, but it felt strangely distant. "We need to stay below until we're out of range," the woman said, her face pale as she helped lower Jacob to a seat. "We're too exposed up there. That thing won't stop until it's sure we're gone." Jacob could only nod, his mind reeling from the events unfolding. His leg was on fire, his body shaking uncontrollably. But he was beyond the point of feeling it all. His mind was fixated on the shark, on the fact that the attack wasn't over yet. Apabals, the sounds of the boat creaking under the shark's onslaught grew louder again. The engine hummed with power, but the lurching motion of the boat told Jacob that it wasn't enough to escape. "It's going to ram us again," Jacob whispered hoarsely. "We're not safe." The woman crouched beside him, her face drawn with worry. "We'll get away, just hang on. Okay? They'll get us out of here." But Jacob wasn't so sure. He could hear the shark now, its thrashing, its growing frustration. It wasn't just attacking the boat. It was hunting. The rumbling growl of the shark's body crashing against the boat intensified, and Jacob braced himself against the wall. Above them, he could hear the crew members shouting at each other, scrambling to stabilize the boat. And then, there was a silence, a heartbeat of quiet, the kind of silence you get just before a storm. And then the shark hit again. The boat groaned, shuddered violently, and for a moment, Jacob thought they were going to capsize. His body slammed against the deck, his breath catching in his chest, his mind spinning. This wasn't a fight for survival anymore. It was a desperate, frantic race to get out of reach before it was too late. The woman who had been with him earlier grabbed his shoulder. "We need to get back above deck. They've got it under control. We're leaving." Jacob struggled to his feet, every movement painful, his leg a constant reminder of the danger. He barely registered her words, too consumed by the overwhelming sense of doom creeping into his bones. His gaze shifted toward the ladder leading back up to the deck. "We need to go," she urged again. With one final, determined effort, Jacob climbed the ladder, his hands slick with sweat and his mind a blur of fear. The boat was moving now, surging forward with all the speed it could muster. The shark had finally disappeared. Jacob lay on the cold metal floor of the rescue boat, his body trembling, his head spinning. He could hear the engine's hum vibrating through the hull, feel the steady roll of the boat cutting through the water, but none of it seemed real. His mind was clouded by shock, his senses dulled by the overwhelming pain that emanated from his leg, his body, and his very soul. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a crushing exhaustion, and Jacob's vision blurred as his eyelids fluttered shut. "Stay with me, man," a voice barked suddenly, snapping him out of his fog. It was one of the rescue crew members, a tall man with short cropped hair and the grim expression of someone who'd seen too much. He was kneeling next to Jacob, pressing a sterile bandage against the deep gash in his leg. His hands were steady, but his eyes were filled with urgency. Jacob tried to focus on the man's face, but the world around him felt like it was closing in. His leg throbbed, the pain a constant, gnawing reminder that the shark's attack had nearly taken everything from him. He felt the pressure on his leg, the blood-slicked bandage being applied, but his mind wasn't really processing it. He couldn't feel the warmth of the sun anymore, couldn't hear the gulls. All he could hear was the rush of his pulse and the weight of everything that had just happened. "Stay with me, Jacob, just a little longer," the man said, his voice low and steady, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "We're getting you out of here. Help's on the way." Jacob opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came. He couldn't speak, couldn't form the words. Everything seemed like it was happening underwater, the world muffled and far away. His eyes flickered to the side and saw two more crew members moving quickly, preparing medical supplies and relaying information to the Coast Guard over the radio. There was nothing calm about this situation. His thoughts were spinning out of control. He needed answers, but all he could manage was a hoarse breath. "Jacob, look at me," the man said, a little firmer now, shaking him gently. "Focus. Can you hear me? Help's almost here. We're going to get you to a hospital. Okay?" Jacob blinked slowly, trying to nod, but it felt like his head was made of lead. The boat bucked slightly with the movement of the waves, but he barely registered it. He couldn't focus on anything except the terrifying memory of the shark, the feeling of its massive jaws closing around him, dragging him under the water. The terror of realizing that he had been in the jaws of death itself. It had been so quick, so violent. His kayak had been no match for the raw power of the great white that had attacked him. It had tossed him into the water like a toy, and then the pain had come. He could still feel the teeth, the crushing pressure, the overwhelming sense that he was being pulled under, never to surface again. The memory was so vivid, so real, that it almost felt like the shark was still out there, circling, waiting for him to slip back into the water. But the boat had been his salvation, and now, as he lay there, still clinging to life, he could only hold on to the hope that he had been pulled from the ocean just in time. "Talk to me, Jacob," the man said again, this time more urgently. "What's your name? Can you tell me your name?" Jacob. Jacob croaked, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Jacob Hensley. Good. You're with me, Jacob. You're doing great," the man said, nodding. "Now listen. The Coast Guard is on the line. We're about to rendezvous with a helicopter. You're going to be okay." Jacob barely heard the man's words. He could feel his eyelids growing heavy again. The darkness was creeping in, but he fought it. He couldn't go back to that place. He couldn't go back to the ocean. A sudden voice pierced through the fog in his mind. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had been with the crew when they had pulled him aboard. Her face was tight with determination, but there was a gentleness in her eyes when she spoke. "Jacob, we need you to stay awake. We need you to stay with us. Okay? You've been through something unimaginable, but you're alive. You're here, and we're getting you to safety." Her voice was like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. He tried to focus on her words, but it was hard. His body was so tired, so broken, but he nodded weakly, forcing his eyes open again, blinking against the light. The woman's hand touched his arm. Again, steady pressure. "We've got you. Help's on the way. Just keep breathing. One step at a time." "Helicopter?" Jacob muttered weakly, the word barely escaping his lips. "Is it here?" "Almost," she replied. "The chopper will be here in minutes. We're getting you out of here. Okay? You're going to be all right." Minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Jacob lay on the deck, the world spinning around him, his body screaming in pain. He could hear the distant sound of the helicopter blades, cutting through the sky, but the roar of the engine was faint compared to the ringing in his ears. Felt like his senses were failing him, his vision blurred, his thoughts scattered. But even in the haze, one thing remained clear. The shark, the attack, the fear. "Jacob," the man said again, shaking his shoulder gently. "Jacob, listen to me. The helicopter's here. We're getting you to the hospital. Just a little longer." Jacob nodded, though it took all his strength to do so. His head felt like it was floating. The words seemed to drift away before he could fully grasp them. But he focused on the sound of the helicopter. It was growing louder, closer. He felt hands on his body, lifting him, guiding him toward the side of the boat. His legs screamed in protest, but it wasn't as important now. What mattered was getting to safety. A gust of wind from the helicopter whipped through the air as the helicopter descended, the noise deafening. Jacob's heart raced as they worked quickly to lift him into a stretcher. He barely registered the movement, his body too weak, his mind too fractured. "Jacob, stay awake." The woman's voice was the only thing that anchored him. "Just stay with us." The world spun once more as the helicopter lifted off, the boat below shrinking quickly into the distance. Jacob's body felt weightless, the turbulence from the chopper almost too much to bear. But as the landscape blurred below him, Jacob closed his eyes. His final, exhausted thoughts focused on the terror he had just barely escaped. When Jacob awoke, he was in a sterile, white hospital room. The buzz of machines filled the silence, and the steady beeping of a heart monitor was the only sign that he was still alive. His leg was bandaged heavily, and an four-line was hooked to his arm. His head was throbbing, his body weak, but at least he was breathing. He was alive. "Jacob?" A voice called softly from the door. He turned to see a nurse enter, her face kind and professional. "You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Jacob didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He just closed his eyes, letting the tears he hadn't realized he'd been holding back fall freely. He was alive, but part of him felt like he'd left something behind in the water, something that would never come back. Jacob awoke to the steady beeping of a machine and the sterile smell of antiseptic. His leg, wrapped in thick bandages, ached dully beneath the sheets. The sensation of numbness slowly faded into something sharper, the pain of 1,000 tiny needles pressing into his flesh. But he couldn't focus on that. His mind, foggy from exhaustion, was still reeling from the attack. The memories were so vivid they felt like they were happening again. The shark's dark eyes, the jaws, the violence. He winced as he tried to move, only to realize that his body felt like it had been shattered into pieces. His chest tightened with anxiety. Where was he? What had happened after the attack? A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Shaken." He turned his head slightly, groaning as the world spun for a moment. A nurse stood at the doorway, a kind face framed by her short, dark hair. She wore a white coat and carried a clipboard, but the look on her face, soft with concern, told him everything he needed to know. "You're in the hospital," she said gently, moving closer to him. "You're safe now." Jacob swallowed hard, blinking up at her. His throat felt dry, tight. His mouth was parched. Where's the boat?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. The nurse smiled warmly, though there was a tinge of sadness in her eyes. "It was a close call, but the Coast Guard got you out of there just in time. They airlifted you to the hospital. You're lucky." "Lucky?" Jacob muttered, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. He didn't feel lucky. He felt shattered. His body, his mind, his soul, all of them were broken in ways he didn't know how to fix. I don't remember much after they pulled me on board," he said slowly, his words stumbling out as he tried to piece together the fragmented memories. "The shark, did it get to the boat?" The nurse paused, her expression shifting to something more solemn. She glanced at the monitor, then back at Jacob. "The boat was damaged, but it made it to the shore with you safely. The crew's okay too. You're the one who took the worst of it." She hesitated before continuing, as though weighing her words carefully. "The shark didn't follow you, Jacob. After the rescue, there were no more sightings." Jacob frowned, his brow furrowing. No more sightings? He couldn't understand. The shark had been relentless, a force of nature that had almost torn him apart. How could it have just disappeared? What do you mean?" It left." His voice quivered in disbelief. The nurse gave him a reassuring smile, though there was a sadness behind her eyes. "That's right. It vanished after the attack. It's not uncommon for sharks to leave once they've taken their bite and realize they can't catch their prey. I'm sorry, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what the crew told us." Jacob nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in, but it didn't feel real. It didn't feel like what had happened to him. "What about the report?" he asked, his throat tightening with the memory of what he had survived. "The attack? Is it documented?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at the door as if checking to see if someone was nearby. She leaned closer. "Yes, there's a report. The Coast Guard filed it. The shark was identified as a great white, likely a juvenile. There's some speculation about why it attacked, but nothing definitive." Jacob's mind raced as he processed her words. A juvenile great white. He had never imagined he would be the one to face down a predator of that size. The very thought of it sent a shudder down his spine. His heart thudded loudly in his chest. He remembered the shark's speed, its power, the cold, calculating way it had circled him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It had been terrifying, but it was the suddenness of the attack that still haunted him the most. It had been like a switch had been flipped, a natural predator going after a vulnerable target. He couldn't stop himself from replaying the events over and over again. The kayak being rammed, the bite, the struggle, the terror, the helplessness, And then the silence. The shark had vanished, just like the nurse said, leaving him floating in the water, barely alive. The nurse took a step back, sensing the shift in Jacob's thoughts. "I'll have the doctor come in to check on you soon. Just rest, okay? Your body needs time to heal." Jacob nodded, but as she left the room, his mind refused to rest. His body may have been safe, but his mind, his soul wasn't. Every part of him was still in the ocean. The memory of the shark, of the terror that had come with it, was too strong to escape. Hours passed before the doctor arrived. Dr. Smith was a tall man with graying hair, his face lined with the years of his profession. He moved with calm precision, his eyes scanning Jacob's charts and nodding as he reviewed the details of the attack. He was professional, but his demeanor was soft, a welcome contrast to the chaotic, panic-driven emotions Jacob had been feeling. "You've been through hell, Jacob," Dr. Smith said, glancing at him over his glasses. "But you're lucky, very lucky. You're going to heal, but it'll take some time. There's no permanent damage, at least not physically, but we need to keep an eye on the infection risk in your leg." Jacob swallowed hard, the familiar taste of fear rising in his throat again. "I don't understand. The shark, it just left? After everything?" Dr. Smith paused for a moment, considering Jacob's question. "Well, I can't say for certain, but sharks, especially great whites, they're territorial. Sometimes they attack out of curiosity, or because they think you're a potential food source. Afterward, if they realize it's not worth the effort, they'll leave. It's not typical behavior, but it happens." Jacob nodded slowly, but something about the doctor's words didn't sit right with him. The attack had felt too personal, too intentional for it to be something as simple as curiosity. He wanted to ask more, wanted to demand answers, to understand why he had been singled out, but the weight of it all was too much. Instead, he just nodded, letting the silence fill the room again. As the hours drifted by, Jacob struggled to sleep. He could feel the weight of the ocean pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the attack. His thoughts raced in a blur of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He had barely survived, and yet here he was. He couldn't understand why the shark had let him live. His mind wandered back to the moments when the shark had first appeared, when the predator had circled him, sizing him up. The cold, unblinking gaze of the great white had locked onto him, and Jacob had felt every muscle in his body tense with the realization that this was not just some accident. The shark had been hunting. A now, distant sound broke Jacob's reverie. The hum of a helicopter, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. Jacob turned his head, his heart skipping a beat as he heard the roar of the engine cutting through the air. He had heard it before, the same sound from that day, the chopper that had rescued him, the moment when his life had been snatched from the jaws of death. He couldn't stop the trembling that overtook him, his breath caught in his throat, his body stiffening with the memory of the water, of the shark, of the terror. The chopper's sound was so close now, and yet, for some reason, it felt more like a warning than a comfort. "Jacob." The nurse appeared in the doorway again, her face soft with concern. She had been watching him, no doubt aware of the shift in his demeanor. Jacob didn't respond at first, his mind still spinning. She came closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You're safe," she said, her voice a calming presence in the storm of his thoughts. "The worst is behind you. Just breathe. Okay? We're taking care of you." Jacob nodded slowly, but the tremor in his hands gave him away. He could still hear the helicopter, still feel the cold sting of the ocean, the memory of the shark's jaws on his leg. He was alive, but the fight wasn't over. "I don't know how to forget it," Jacob said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The nurse's eyes softened, and she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to forget it, Jacob. You just have to move forward. You're still here. That's what matters." Jacob swallowed hard, trying to find the words to express the turmoil inside him. But for the first time since the attack, he felt a flicker of something small, something fragile. The days blurred into each other as Jacob drifted in and out of consciousness, his body still reeling from the brutality of the shark attack. The throbbing pain in his leg was constant, a reminder of just how close he had come to losing it all. Every time he opened his eyes, the sterile white walls of the hospital greeted him like an unwelcome reality. The painkillers they gave him dulled everything: his thoughts, his senses, his connection to the world, but they couldn't dull the images that replayed in his mind. The shark's dark eyes, the immense power of its jaws, the way his kayak had been tossed like a toy. Jacob felt like a ghost, moving between the haze of sleep and the harsh clarity of his trauma. But every time he woke, it felt as though a part of him had been left behind in the ocean. Something in him had snapped that day, something that would never return. The shark had taken it with him. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts spiraling as his leg throbbed again, a dull ache that pulsed with each beat of his heart. The doctors had said they had to amputate below the knee to prevent the infection from spreading further. The trauma to the muscle, the torn skin and bone, had been too severe to save. And though they reassured him it was the only choice, it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. The door to his room creaked open, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned his head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. The doctor entered, a woman with short, graying hair and an air of authority that he recognized immediately. "Good morning, Jacob," Dr. Smith said, her voice calm and measured. "How are you feeling today?" Jacob didn't answer right away. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. He swallowed, forcing the words out. "It hurts. A lot." She nodded, as though expecting the response. "That's to be expected. The healing process will be slow, and the pain can sometimes get worse before it gets better. But we're managing it with the medication." Jacob's eyes drifted to the bandage wrapped around his leg, the thick gauze and the unmistakable lump beneath it where his calf used to be. His stomach churned. He hated looking at it, hated remembering what had been taken from him. I can't believe it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My leg, it's gone." Dr. Smith didn't try to sugarcoat it. She knew what he was feeling, and she wasn't about to pretend otherwise. "It's a big loss, one that will take time to process, and there will be difficult days ahead, no question. But you're here. You're alive." Jacob swallowed hard, trying to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to overtake him. He felt like a shell of the person he used to be, and the idea of navigating the world with one leg felt insurmountable. Felt like too much. "I don't know how to do this," he muttered. "I don't know how to live like this." The doctor's expression softened. "You don't have to figure it all out right now, Jacob. It's okay to take things one step at a time. Healing doesn't just happen physically, it happens mentally too, and we'll help you through it." The words were kind, but they didn't seem to offer much comfort. Jacob didn't know how to explain the heaviness. He felt the constant feeling that something was missing. There was a hole inside him now, a vast emptiness where his leg used to be. It wasn't just the limb he had lost, it was everything that had come with it. His independence, his confidence, his sense of self. He clenched his fists, the tightness in his chest almost suffocating. "I can't even walk. How am I supposed to keep going? How do I live like this?" Dr. Smith paused, considering him for a moment. "We'll get you fitted for a prosthetic as soon as we can. The technology today is incredible, Jacob. It won't be easy, but you'll learn to move again. It might take some time, but you'll adjust. But it'll never be the same, will it?" Jacob's voice cracked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'll never be the same." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was lower, more empathetic. "No, you won't be. But that doesn't mean you won't find new ways to live, new ways to move forward. It's going to take time. There will be moments when you feel like you can't go on, when it seems impossible. But that's when you lean on the people around you. That's when you take it one day at a time." Jacob didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt a wave of emotion build in his chest, threatening to break. His eyes stung, but he didn't let the tears fall. Not yet. He had to hold it together. He had to. Dr. Smith's gaze softened, and she placed a hand gently on his arm. I'm going to leave you to rest now, but we'll be here every step of the way, Jacob. You're not alone in this. He nodded, but the words felt hollow. The thought of going on without his leg, without the freedom he once had, felt suffocating. He wasn't sure how to move forward. He wasn't sure he even wanted to. That afternoon, Jacob's sister, Kate, arrived. She was a few years younger than him, with dark hair and the same sharp eyes that had always been there, watching over him like a hawk. She had always been the more practical one, the one who had everything under control. But when she walked into his hospital room, her face twisted with concern. Her eyes red-rimmed, and Jacob could see the hurt in her expression that she tried so hard to hide. "Tay, big brother," Tate said softly, her voice thick with emotion as she stepped toward him. Jacob didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. His emotions were still too raw, too jagged. He didn't want her to see him like this broken, vulnerable, but there was no hiding it, no pretending. He had to face her. Kate set a bag of snacks down on the table beside his bed, her hands shaking slightly as she unpacked it. "I talked to Mom. She's really worried about you." Jacob forced a small smile, though it felt unnatural. "Tell her I'm fine. I'm alive. That's all that matters." Kate's eyes flickered with sadness, but she didn't say anything for a moment. She just sat down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. "I know you're going through a lot right now," she said, her voice soft, "but we'll figure this out. You're not alone." Jacob nodded but didn't meet her eyes. "I don't know how to do this. I don't even know where to start. I feel so lost." Kate squeezed his hand, her touch comforting but not enough to chase away the hollow feeling inside him. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. I know it's going to be hard, but we'll get through it together. We always have." Jacob's chest tightened, the weight of everything crashing down on him in that moment. He felt like a different person, someone who was no longer capable of doing the things he once loved. The kayaking, the adventures, the freedom of the open water. All of it was gone now, taken by the shark, and he didn't know how to move past it. "I don't even want to leave this room," he admitted quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't want to face anyone. I don't want to see the way they look at me." Kate's voice was steady, filled with love and understanding. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll take it one step at a time. You don't have to face the world right now. Just focus on getting better." He looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion. "How do you keep going? How do you just live when everything's different?" Kate didn't answer right away. She simply held his hand, her grip strong and steady. "I think you take it day by day, one moment at a time, and when you feel like you can't do it anymore, you reach out. You don't have to do this on your own." Jacob closed his eyes, the words sinking deep into his chest. It wasn't a solution, but it was something, a lifeline, and maybe that's what he needed, just a little bit of hope, one day at a time. Later that night, as the hospital room quieted, Jacob found himself staring out the window at the darkened sky. The city lights blinked softly in the distance, a reminder that the world still went on, even if it felt like his hands stopped. He wasn't sure how to move forward, but for the first time in days, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way through this, one step at a time. The weeks that followed the attack were a blur of recovery. Jacob's body slowly began to adjust to the prosthetic, but his mind was a different story. Despite the hospital visits, the physical therapy, and the endless encouragement from his family, something inside him refused to heal. The trauma of that day, of being dragged under the surface by a creature so powerful, so relentless, was not something that could be fixed with time or medication. It lingered, haunting every waking moment. One chilly morning, Jacob sat on the porch of his sister's house, his leg propped up on a cushion as he stared out at the ocean. The sea was calm today, the waves gentle and rhythmic as they rolled onto the beach. It looked so peaceful, so inviting, and yet, It felt like a world that was no longer his. The beach had once been a sanctuary and escape. Now it was a reminder of everything he had lost. "How are you feeling?" Kate asked, her voice cutting through his thoughts as she stepped outside with a cup of coffee in her hand. Jacob didn't answer immediately. He just watched the water, the blue depths stretching out beyond the horizon. It was hard to focus on anything other than the image of the shark, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. "I'm okay," he finally said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. Kate sat down beside him, her eyes scanning him carefully. "I know it's been tough, but you're making progress. The doctors are really impressed with how you're handling everything." Jacob turned his head slowly to look at her, his gaze dark and tired. "I don't feel like I'm handling it, Kate. I feel like I'm just surviving, going through the motions. But inside, I'm a mess." She squeezed his hand gently, her voice soft. "I know it's hard, but you've made it through the worst part. You're still here. That's something." Jacob wanted to believe her, but the weight of his loss was too heavy. It wasn't just the leg. It was the life he had known, the freedom he had taken for granted, the feeling of being invincible when he was on the water. Now all of that was gone, swept away by a single encounter with a predator from the depths of the ocean. Before Jacob could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from the hospital. He'd been expecting this. "The official report on your attack has been filed. It's time to discuss the details." He read the message a few times, trying to process it. The report had been a long time coming. The authorities had asked him to sit down for an interview weeks ago, but he had avoided it. He didn't want to relive the attack, didn't want to go through the details again. But now it was inevitable. The report was out there, and it wasn't going to disappear. Jacob looked at Kate, his face drawn. "They filed the official report. It's time." She nodded, but didn't say anything. They both knew what it meant. The authorities needed his account. They needed him to confirm the details so they could release the final report to the media and the public. Jacob wasn't sure he was ready for that. He wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. The interview took place at the local police station. The room was sterile, bare, the kind of room that smelled like a place where people came to talk about bad things. The officer sitting across from Jacob was a middle-aged man with a hard face, his eyes keen as he scribbled notes on a pad of paper. "Jacob Hensley," the officer said, looking at him over the top of his glasses. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. This isn't easy, I know, but it's necessary for the investigation." Jacob nodded silently. His leg, still sore and tender, was propped up on the chair beside him. He hadn't wanted to leave the house, but he knew this was something he couldn't avoid. If he wanted closure, he had to face it. "I'll be as brief as possible, Mr. Hensley," the officer continued, his tone professional but not unkind. "We're compiling the details for the report. The shark attack is the most serious one in this area in years, and we want to ensure the public understands what happened. We need to know what you saw, what you felt, and what you remember." Jacob took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The memories surged immediately, sharp, vivid, terrifying. He clenched his fists and spoke, his voice low but firm. "It was a great white. I don't know exactly how big it was, but it was massive. I saw the dorsal fin first. It was circling me, watching me. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought maybe it was just a curious seal, something else. But then it hit me, hard, and I was thrown into the water." The officer didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, taking notes as Jacob spoke. "I thought I was dead right then. It was fast, too fast. The kayak was flipped, and I went into the water. I saw the shark then, just beneath the surface. His eyes, Jesus, they were black, empty. It didn't care that I was there. It didn't hesitate. It attacked." Jacob's throat tightened as he relived those moments. He swallowed, trying to push past the pain, but it was impossible. "I tried to fight it off," he continued, his voice cracking. "I punched it. I kicked it. I tried to get back to the kayak, but it wouldn't let me." kept circling. Every time I thought I was safe, it would strike again. And then it bit me. It clamped down on my leg, my whole body was in its mouth. I thought I was going to die right there. The officer paused, looking up at Jacob, his expression serious. The shark didn't leave after that? Jacob shook his head slowly. No, not until the boat arrived. Kept coming back, circling, hitting the kayak again. Just waiting. I don't know why it didn't finish the job. I don't know why it left. The officer seemed to think for a moment, then asked a question that Jacob had been dreading. Do you believe this shark was targeting you specifically? Or was it simply reacting out of instinct? Jacob's gaze hardened, the anger rising in his chest again. It wasn't an accident. The way it circled me, the way it attacked, it knew what it was doing. It wasn't just hungry, it was hunting. I'm not a marine biologist, but that much was clear. The officer nodded slowly, scribbling something down. Understood. So you're saying this was not a case of mistaken identity? Jacob's fists clenched again, his pulse quickening. No. Knew I was there. It was waiting for me. It wasn't a mistake. The officer leaned back in his chair, considering Jacob's words carefully. All right, Mr. Hensley. I appreciate you being so forthcoming. You've given us a lot of valuable information. This is a rare incident. I'm sure you've been told that the shark wasn't acting in a typical manner. It was a juvenile great white, and usually they're not known for attacks like this. Jacob raised an eyebrow, his exhaustion giving way to frustration. So, you're saying it was just confused? Just a mistake? The officer held up a hand. No, not at all. I'm saying that this shark may have been acting out of territorial instinct or possibly because of the influx of seals in the area. But we'll never know for sure why it chose to attack you. I can tell you, though, that based on our records, this shark has not been reported in the area before. This wasn't a regular predator, and in a way that makes this attack even more unusual. Jacob's mind swirled with the officer's words. A juvenile great white. No history of aggression. It didn't make sense. So what happens now? Jacob as Ted. His voice tinged with bitterness. What's being done to keep this from happening again? The officer sighed. Well, we're working with marine biologists to track any movements of the shark in the area. We're also reinforcing the warnings and advisories to locals and tourists. But unfortunately, the ocean isn't a controlled environment. There's only so much we can do. Jacob leaned forward slightly, his voice low but intense. You think this will just go away? That we can just pretend it was an isolated incident and move on? The officer's eyes narrowed. I don't think that at all, Mr. Hensley. But the reality is that sharks live in the ocean. They've always been there. We can't control them. What we can do is ensure that people are informed, that they know the risks when they enter the water. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the sides, his head spinning. The truth was there, buried in the officer's words. The attack had been rare, but it wasn't the shark's fault. He was just doing what it was born to do, and Jacob was left to live with the consequences. Thank you, Jacob said quietly, his voice distant. I guess that's all I can do. Just move forward. The officer stood, giving him a nod. We'll keep you updated if there's any more information, Mr. Hensley. You take care. Jacob watched him leave, the door clicking shut behind him. He sat there for a long while, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The ocean, the shark, the attack, the future. He didn't have the answers, but maybe, just maybe, the only thing he could do now was move forward one step at a time. Jacob's days had become a rhythmic blend of physical therapy, doctor's appointments, and the quiet solitude of his sister's home. The mornings were slow, filled with the silence of a house that once echoed with the sound of his life moving at full speed. He spent hours in front of the window, watching the waves crash against the shore, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and of what he still couldn't bring himself to face. The sea was no longer a place of freedom. It was a place where his entire world had been ripped apart. The days grew colder as winter set in. The sunlight came later and stayed shorter, but the chill in the air had nothing on the coldness that had settled deep within him. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of being hollow. His body had begun the slow, painful process of adapting to the prosthetic, but his mind? That was still a mess, full of dark thoughts and frustration. It wasn't that he didn't try to move forward. He did, but every time he set his foot on the ground, trying to take a step toward healing, the weight of what had happened to him seemed to pull him back, to drag him deeper into the dark. It had been almost 2 months since the attack. 2 months of endless therapy sessions, of awkward movements and strained smiles. 2 months of trying to find some semblance of normalcy, but feeling like the man he was before the shark attack was gone, never to return. The therapist told him it would take time. They all said it, his family, his friends, but he didn't have time. He had memories that haunted him, and they didn't care about how much time had passed. One afternoon, Jacob sat in the living room, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. The warmth of the flames did nothing to melt the cold gnawing at his insides. Kate was in the kitchen, talking to someone on the phone, probably their mother, who had been calling constantly, checking in. Jacob appreciated it, but sometimes it felt suffocating. He didn't want to be treated like a fragile thing. He didn't want to be coddled, but at the same time, he didn't know how to stop them from doing it. His prosthetic leg rested beside him, leaning against the chair, a stark reminder of how far he still had to go. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, gripping it tightly, trying to calm the restlessness building inside him. The doorbell rang, its sudden chime pulling him from his thoughts. He frowned, glancing toward the kitchen. Kate was still on the phone. With a sigh, Jacob pushed himself to his feet, the prosthetic leg making the movement awkward but familiar. He steadied himself against the wall as he walked toward the door. The sound of his steps was strangely muted, the once confident cadence now replaced by the steady, mechanical rhythm of the prosthetic. He opened the door to find a man standing there, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Hensley?" the man asked, his voice soft and polite. "Yeah, that's me," Jacob replied, squinting at the man. He wasn't sure if he recognized him. "I'm Officer Green," the man introduced himself, nodding. "I'm with the local sheriff's department. We've been investigating the shark attack that occurred in Shark Alley a couple of months ago. I'd like to ask you a few more questions, if that's all right." Jacob's stomach twisted. He didn't want to relive the attack. He didn't want to talk about it. But the officer's calm demeanor and the official nature of the visit told him it wasn't a request he could turn down. "Sure, come in," Jacob said reluctantly, stepping aside to allow the officer into the house. Green nodded his thanks, stepping into the living room. He set the clipboard down on the coffee table and sat across from Jacob. He didn't look like a typical cop, no intimidating uniform or rough edges. He looked like someone who had been in the job long enough to understand when to push and when to let things be. But Jacob could see the weight in his eyes. He could see that this investigation was important to him. "I know this is difficult, Mr. Hensley," Officer Green began, his voice steady. "But we need your statement for the official report. There are still a lot of unknowns about that shark and why it attacked, and your account will help us understand what happened. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Jacob shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. He didn't want to be part of the investigation anymore. He just wanted it to be over. But he knew he had to do this. He owed it to the people who were out there, unprepared, not knowing what kind of danger might be lurking beneath the surface. "I've already told the police what happened," Jacob replied, his voice tight. "I don't really have anything new to add." "I understand, Mr. Hensley, but we've reviewed the initial statements, and there are still some discrepancies," Officer Green said, his tone patient but firm. "We need a more complete picture of what you experienced. The attack was incredibly unusual, and we need to understand the behavior of the shark, especially since there's been some debate about the nature of the attack. We've interviewed several other witnesses, but your account is the most vital." Jacob's eyes dropped to the floor, He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had no desire to go over the details again. The memories were still so fresh, so raw, but the officer was right. He had to do it. "All right?" Jacob said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you what happened." It was strange, talking about it again. Talking about the shark, about the way it had attacked him, about the fear that had gripped him when he realized there was no escape. Officer Green listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but not interrupting. Jacob's words came out haltingly at first, the memories coming in flashes, bits and pieces, like an old film reel skipping frames. "I was just out there, you know?" Jacob began, his voice quieter than he'd intended. "I was paddling alone. I've done it 100 times before. Never thought anything of it. I know the water. I know the risks. But nothing prepares you for something like that." He took a deep breath, his mind going back to that moment when the water had gone quiet, when the eerie stillness had first set in. "The shark, when I saw the fin, I thought it was just a dolphin or a seal. I didn't think much of it. But then it started circling, and that's when I realized something was wrong. Something wasn't right." Green was taking notes, but his eyes never left Jacob's face. He didn't push him, didn't rush him, and for that, Jacob was grateful. He didn't want to be rushed. He needed to get this out, even if it made him uncomfortable. "It hit me hard," Jacob continued. "I didn't even have time to react. It knocked me into the water. I didn't even have a chance to get back up, to get to my kayak. And when I saw it beneath me, chisels, its eyes, I can't get that image out of my head." Officer Green's expression softened. He could tell that this was hard for Jacob, but he didn't stop him. "It must have been terrifying." Jacob nodded, rubbing his face as though trying to erase the memory. "Terrifying doesn't even begin to cover it. The thing was huge, came at me again, and I tried to fight it off, but it just kept circling. It knew what it was doing. It wasn't just a random attack." The officer leaned forward slightly, his pen poised over the pad. "You said it wasn't random. What do you mean by that?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "It was methodical, like it was hunting, like it was waiting for me to make a move. Didn't just bite and swim away. Came back, it circled, knew I was there. It didn't think I was just food. It thought I was prey." Officer Green was silent for a long time, scribbling notes. Jacob's hands were trembling, but he clenched them tightly, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let the officer see how much it still affected him. "Thank you, Mr. Hensley," Green said at last, breaking the silence. "I know this wasn't easy. You've given us a lot to work with. We'll continue our investigation, and we'll keep you updated." Jacob nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I just want it to be over." The officer stood, collecting his clipboard. "There will be. We're doing everything we can to understand what happened. The report will be finalized soon, and then we'll issue a public warning. You've done your part. Now you can focus on your recovery." After the officer left, Jacob sat in silence for a long while, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. The memories of that day, of the shark, of the attack, felt heavier now. Talking about it didn't make it go away. It didn't make the fear disappear. It only made it more real. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Kate walked into the room a few minutes later, having finished her call. She saw the look on Jacob's face and instantly knew what had happened. "You talked to him, didn't you?" she asked gently. Jacob didn't answer at first. He just stared at the floor, his fingers clenched tightly around the armrest of his chair. "Yeah, I did." Kate sat down beside him, her hand resting on his. "How do you feel?" He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "I don't know. I feel like I've been dragged through it all over again. But maybe it's good to talk about it." "I don't know." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "It's gone, Jacob. You're facing it. That's the first step to moving forward." "I don't know if I can move forward," he muttered, his voice breaking. Kate smiled softly, her gaze full of understanding. "One step at a time, big brother. one step at a time, and for the first time in months, Jacob felt the smallest spark of hope flicker inside him. Maybe he wasn't so broken after all. Maybe there was a way forward. Jacob stood at the edge of the dock, the ocean stretching out before him in a vast, endless expanse. The cold breeze brushed against his face, and the sound of the waves crashing against the wooden pylons was oddly soothing. The place felt familiar but foreign all at once. The sea had once been a source of adventure, a place of solace where he could escape from the world. Now, it felt like a different world, entirely a world that had taken something from him and never given it back. 2 months had passed since the shark attack, and while his body had begun the long process of healing, his mind was still fragmented, still haunted by the events that had unfolded out in Shark Alley. The memory of the great white shark circling him, the violent attack, the pain, and the terror those images were etched into his mind, impossible to erase. They came to him in flashes, unbidden and relentless. Even now, standing on this dock, the water below seemed like an ominous, silent presence waiting, watching. "Kay, you all right?" Kate's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and familiar. Jacob turned to see his sister approaching, a worried expression on her face. She had been his constant support, never leaving his side since the day of the attack. It had been hard on her too, harder than he ever realized. She had seen him at his lowest, had watched him struggle, and had never once given up on him. "I'm fine," Jacob said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just needed some air." Kate nodded but didn't leave. She knew better than to press him too hard when he wasn't ready to talk. Instead, she stood beside him, both of them looking out at the water in silence. For a moment it was peaceful. No words, just the rhythm of the waves and the distant call of seagulls. "You know," Kate finally said, breaking the silence, "I've been talking to Mom. She wants you to come down for Thanksgiving. I think it'd be good for you, Jacob. A change of scenery, you know? Just a little time with the family." Jacob winced at the mention of Thanksgiving. It had always been a holiday filled with laughter, sod, and family, everything he had taken for granted. But that was before the attack, before everything had changed. The idea of sitting around a table, pretending everything was okay, felt like an impossible task. His leg, the constant reminder of his new reality, would be hard to hide. And the questions people asking him about the attack, the details he couldn't bear to relive. He wasn't sure he was ready for that. "I don't know, Kate," he said, his voice quiet. "It just feels too soon. I don't know if I'm ready to face everyone, to see them looking at me like I'm some fragile thing." Kate's hand rested on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You're not fragile, Jacob. You're stronger than you think. You've come so far already. It's okay to take that next step. It's okay to let people see the real you, even if it feels hard." Jacob turned to look at her, his eyes full of emotion. "It's not just the leg, Kate. It's everything. Everything I lost. The ocean, my confidence. Hell, even my sense of who I am. I don't know how to face all of that yet. I don't even know where to start." She smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You start by taking one step at a time, just like you've been doing. And you don't have to do it all at once. You take your time, but you don't have to hide anymore. You're not alone in this." Jacob looked back at the water, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to stop hiding, to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. He had spent so long running from his reality, from the pain, from the fear, but he couldn't keep running forever. It was time to face it, to take control of his future again, one step at a time. A week later, Jacob found himself sitting in the small living room of his mother's house, the familiar scent of turkey and stuffing filling the air. It was Thanksgiving, and though he still felt like a stranger in his own life, he had agreed to come. His mother had insisted, and Kate had been relentless in her encouragement. And so, here he was, sitting on the couch, surrounded by family who hadn't seen him in months, but who loved him nonetheless. Jacob's mom, A woman in her mid-60s with graying hair and warm, wrinkled hands bustled around the kitchen, checking the oven, stirring the gravy. She looked up and smiled as she caught sight of him sitting in the living room. "Jacob," she said, her voice full of love and relief. "You're finally here. I've missed you, darling." Jacob forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know, Mom. I've missed you too." She came over and hugged him, her arms wrapping around him tightly. The familiar warmth of her embrace made his chest tighten, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the comfort of being home. He hadn't realized how much he needed this, how much he had missed his family. But even in the warmth of her embrace, the unease gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being incomplete. Kate walked into the room, her eyes immediately locking onto Jacob. She seemed to be watching him, her gaze both loving and concerned. She knew him better than anyone else, and though she was happy to see him here, she could tell how uncomfortable he felt. "Everything's almost ready," their mother said, stepping back with a smile. "Just a little longer. Can you help me with the bread, Jacob?" Jacob nodded and got to his feet, taking a deep breath. The prosthetic leg felt awkward beneath him, and he had to concentrate as he walked toward the kitchen. Every step still felt like a battle, like his body was betraying him, but he was learning to push through it. With each movement, the world felt a little less foreign. "Sure, Mom," he replied, his voice steady as he took the bread from the counter. The smell of freshly baked bread made his stomach rumble, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of normalcy. Kate followed him into the kitchen, leaning against the doorframe as she watched him work. "I'm proud of you, you know," she said softly. "You didn't have to come today, but you did. You're doing great." Jacob looked up at her, his eyes tired but grateful. "I don't know if great is the word, but I'm trying." "You're doing better than you think," she said with a smile. "Just remember, it's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to take your time." Jacob nodded, his fingers still working on the bread as he tried to steady himself. His leg ached from standing, but he didn't want to let it stop him. He didn't want to let the pain rule his life anymore. Later, as they sat down to dinner, Jacob felt the weight of the moment. His family was here, his mom, Kate, his cousins, and they were all staring at him with a mix of concern, affection, and perhaps a bit of pity. It was hard to know for sure. His mom kept glancing at him, her eyes filled with love, but there was a quiet sadness there too, the kind that only a mother could feel for her child. "Jacob," his mom said, breaking the silence that had settled over the table. "How are you really doing? I mean, with everything? The leg? The therapy? How are you feeling?" Jacob shifted in his seat, feeling the eyes of the room on him. It would be so easy to lie, to say that everything was fine, that he was adjusting just fine, that life was returning to normal. But he knew that wasn't true. "Not yet. I'm getting there," Jacob said slowly, trying to choose his words carefully. "It's hard, Mom, really hard, but I'm trying. I'm still trying to figure it all out." She nodded, her eyes brimming with understanding. "I know, sweetheart, and we're all here for you no matter what. We just want you to be happy. We just want you to heal." Jacob looked around at the table, at the people who loved him, and felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel the weight of their love, the love that had never wavered, even when he had pushed them away. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to do this by himself. "I know, Mom," Jacob whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not sure how long it's going to take, but I'm going to get there. I'm going to figure it out." As the evening wore on, the tension in Jacob's chest began to ease. The laughter around the table, the conversation, the warmth of his family's presence, it felt like the first step towards something new. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe it wasn't easy, but it was progress, and that was enough for now. For the first time in a long time, Jacob allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't as bleak as he had thought. One step at a time, one moment at a time, and with that, for the first time since the attack, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope.